Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Poisons and Pestilence podcast. This episode was recorded in early November. Today, we have a very special guest with a very special biography, and we're joined by Jerry Smith, who, as you will hear, has taken a long and circuitous route into the world of chemical weapon demilitarization and disarmament, and is here today to talk to us about the disarmament of the Syrian state of its chemical weapons stockpile. So, Jerry, welcome. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Lovely to be with you, Brett.
Let's start. Tell me a bit about yourself and what you do and how you've ended up where you are, and in particular, how you've ended up spending quite a lot of time thinking about and working on the issue of chemical weapon disarmament and destruction.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I joined the army 20 kilos ago in the early 90s, and I ended up in the Royal Engineers in bomb disposal. And when you're involved with military bomb disposal on the engineering side, a bunch of that includes, and bear in mind, I'm sort of right at the back end of the Cold War, so we still had, concerns and issues around Soviet chemical and biological weapons, which were a real thing and a real threat, particularly on the chemical side. So, we had training on how to dispose of munitions. So that was my first sort of foray into the world of CBRN, on top of all the whole army sort of, NBC training of masks and that and the like. From there, I went into, I actually went into commercial bomb disposal and demining for a few years, where there wasn't really anything particular around the CBRN field, although there were a couple of military locations that we ended up bidding and removing unexploded ordnance from, but also had a concern of particularly the test kits. So back in the day, there were actually test kits which included live agent, little vials of live agent.
Brilliant.
But there was a concern for that, so we had to, as it happened, we didn't come across any. But certainly for the guys and girls of my teams that were doing the excavation, we had to make sure there was actions on in case a vial was smashed and we were posed with a threat. From there, I moved on to go to Porton Down, and I actually was at Porton Down in total for 6 years. Firstly, on the demilitarization side, which involved essentially some historical sites. Again, the UK is dotted with quite a few sites where there were manufactured or loading and storage sort of places in various dispersed airfields.
We had Steve Johnson came on a few episodes ago, and we touched upon, I think it was Operation Clean Sweep, if my memory serves me right, but at least one of the operations that was involved. And of course, as we mentioned in that episode as well, these things still seem to turn up, particularly in Lincolnshire, unsurprisingly. And
yes, absolutely, very much airfield, but also army side as well. Quite a few years ago now, there was some mustard agent was discovered at one of these stay behind hide, the buried locations that the Brits had sort of set up in the early part of the war with a concern of a German invasion. So still very much involved in that, with some dealings, not so much with live agent, but certainly with breakdown products. And yeah, there are a few places that Lincolnshire, particularly because of the association with the RAF. I was also involved in the counter-terrorism side, on the CBRN side as well, the UK, part of the UK capability on that side as well. And then I moved into sort of counter-proliferation as well, so engagement with particularly the Russians. There's a global partnership program, and the essentially, because the Russians were skint, or claiming to be skint, we were helping them with remove of their big chemical weapons program, which various governments, including the Canadians. So that kind of got me into dealing in international worlds, where I then was exposed to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. I first joined them in 2006. I got it because the instructors, some of their inspectors came to Porton for training. I was part of the training delivery team and thought, this is quite an interesting little setup. So I joined in 2006. I did it I was an inspector then for 3 years. I then actually came back to the UK for a while and then went back out there and rejoined again in 2011. I've touched on CBNR, actually, some radiological hazards I've also dealt with back in my time, but the focus was pretty much on chemical. And I'd also like to just point out that I'm not a scientist. I'm actually an engineer by background. So I like to think I can speak scientist, but and I have a reasonable background, but I'm absolutely an engineer.
Wonderful. So today's story deals, of course, with Syria, an episode in the history of chemical warfare, still contemporary, of course, but an episode I think which has shaped a lot of people's understanding of chemical weapons or chemical warfare more broadly. It's certainly, I think, shaped the trajectory of my career and other people coming through. So our story, I guess, starts 2012, 2013, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, in some ways you could go back a bit further than that. So the Chemical Weapons Convention was set up in the late 90s. It's a legacy of actually the Soviet Union and United States back in the day, realizing that chemical weapons really weren't the way forward in terms of war fighting. I mean, maneuver warfare, both nations or both blocks had quite significant counter CBR capabilities. So any kind of benefits that there were, and frankly, ownership of chemical weapons is quite hard. It's expensive. It's expensive to make. It's expensive to store. It's dangerous to the user as well. So all those and how modern warfare had evolved in the sort of 70s and 80s, it actually wasn't necessarily a particularly useful. It's a bully's weapon, really. But if you have peer groups, it becomes slightly more neutralizing in terms of benefit. So the convention happened. Most countries joined. A whole bunch of notable countries didn't join for various reasons. Israel signed, but it's not ratified. And the process is you sign it, and then it has to be ratified nationally as well. UK was one of the founder members, and the convention has various articles which are all about agreeing not to produce any more chemical weapons, agreeing to destroy what you have, and you declare. And it is very much trust but verify. So there isn't a world police that cuts around there. You basically validate the declarations, and it's all about trust and partnership building and that sort of thing. But there are some articles in there that allow inspections to take place, which was a routine process that I did particularly with the United States and Russia, but I also in India. I closed down India's project to destroy their complete quantity of agents, and we'll come on to that because actually India's program was about the same size as Syria's, about 1,500 tons in total. Certainly, of what Syria declared. We might have a discussion about whether that was everything or not at a later date, but that's essentially where we're at there. Looking at that, we have to look at where Syria was. Syria was not a member state, but there's a little known part of the convention which allows essentially the OPCW to be a subcontractor to the UN, who does have the power to do a chemical or biological investigation of alleged use.
Secretary General's investigation mechanism.
Yeah, which actually was developed in the 80s, actually the height of the Cold War.
That was the Iran-Iraq war.
Well, actually, and before that, the only other time I think that was actually triggered was accusations of use of biological weapons in Southeast Asia, with various toxin use as well.
The BS ones.
Perhaps the BPOO, yes, if that's what we're talking about. Yeah. But yeah, there was various accusations as well. And so now there isn't a standing team to do that. That is very much an on-call team of countries will submit experts to join a team. But the problem with that, of course, is if you're only meeting your contemporaries once a year, or maybe even more infrequently, the sort of the teamwork, all that sort of good team stuff just doesn't exist. So you'll come together, it becomes an ad hoc group, which of course limits potentially the capability. And there was not necessarily equipment, there's no storage, anything, any sort of formalized structure. The Secretary General mechanism is still an ad hoc capability. So when the Chemical Weapons Convention happened, the UN sort of said, can you support this? And because you had this capability yourselves in terms of investigation, it means that actually it builds out some capability. And so that was essentially the mechanism. So in 2012, the Syrian, what had started as a protest was turning into a proper civil war, with all the awfulness that went on. And you had this open source knowledge that Syria possessed a chemical weapons program. The French were aware of it as a former mandate. They'd supported the Syrians, but it was also open source that they'd acquired a lot of protective gear, manufacturing gear, as we'll hear that some of their production equipment was made in West Germany, and pretty high end stuff. Now you can, obviously the chemical weapons programs can be masked in quite legitimate industrial chemical development. And so there was a certain awareness of it. So even though Syria was not a member state and therefore outside the OPCW's jurisdiction, it was still something we kept an eye on. And because of this article and this arrangement with the UN, and it became increasingly right at the end of 2012, there was we started to get in regular contact with the UN, saying that that an accusation of use might be called, and if so, we would be calling upon you to help us out. I went to New York. We had sort of started to meet with UN personnel, interlocutors, legal, technical, security, all sorts of things to build this. And this sort of culminated then in February, March time of 2013, when the first accusations came in of use of chemical weapons within that Syrian civil war. Both the British and French sort of accusing the Syrians of doing it, and the Syrians accusing opposition forces. This team was set up. The UN team set up. Now, the first thing was I was fired because I was a Brit passport holder and part of the permanent, and the Brits being part of the permanent five of the Security Council. Ban Ki-moon decided it was best politically wise that no members, passport carriers of the P5 were on the team. So I left the team in a very capable hands of a dear colleague, Canadian, and I went off to New York as the liaison officer, and I spent a month and a half in New York supporting the preparation of this team to go out there. And the team was looking at these historical events sort of in late 2012 and subsequently in 2013 as well. What happened then was that there was a slight delay in the team actually getting together and going in. And part of that was because the Brits and the French then accused Syrian government of various other uses, and the Syrians weren't so keen about those accusations being investigated. But anyway, ultimately the team got out there and they went out and they deployed out in August of 2013. So, 11 years now. So this is where it sort of kicks off. And I think one thing to remind ourselves there is that Syria is a very different place now. Only about a third of the Syrian territory was controlled by the Syrian government. The other areas were held by the opposition. The opposition was sort of a single group. It was fragmented in itself. Some were relatively moderate, some were more extreme, and actually ultimately some of them were Al-Qaeda and some of them turned into what was in IS as well. So a big range of opposition forces, and the Syrian government very much on its uppers. And there was sort of some logic of perhaps why the Syrians might want to use chemical weapons, because essentially they were perhaps on their, in the final days of losing that civil war. And this is way before the Russians, well, not way before, but certainly a few years before the Russians probably got involved. So that's the sort of the situation. Damascus in the southwest of the country, the capital, you couldn't fly into, or certainly not from the west you couldn't, because the airport itself was under fire. So any kind of movement was via Lebanon. And you've got the two big cities north of Damascus sort of running up parallel to the coast, really, of Homs in the center of the country, and then Aleppo at the top of the country. I mean, all on the western side. And then Latakia, which is a port. There's a couple of ports along the Mediterranean, but right in the eastern corner edge of the Mediterranean is a port, Latakia, which we'll come on to. So that was really the situation. The Syrian government very much has uppers, and this investigation to take place. And of course, the plan was the team was going to go in there. They were then going to drive to these various sites up and down the country and investigate these locations. And then the unthinkable happened. Those, second day in country, the videos and the reports started to come out of these attacks that were happening in various suburbs, basically, of Damascus. And immediately, of course, the UN swung into saying, "It's right, we need to go and have a look at those." Scott Cairns, my Canadian colleague, and the team started to reconfigure. They were looking at going to historic sites, as in months old, and now we were looking at a site that was clear agent had been used. And back in OPCW headquarters, I ran not just me, but we had an assessment team there that were trying to review a video and sending them feed, because we appreciated they were in the middle of it. And it just allowed us us slightly detached to take all the video feed and audio and reports and whatever and start to try and make sense of it and pick up sort of visual evidence of what it could be. And, a lot of agent poisoning can be relatively non-specific in an early event, but obviously that sort of thing of the heavy salivation of the mouth, a lot of the involuntary muscle spasming, it was starting to point towards something, in the sort of nerve agent field almost immediately.
And it was clear that the scale was significantly larger than what had been seen. And that was in terms of the range of individuals and locations which appeared on feed all of a sudden. It didn't. Sometimes you see events and it's unclear beyond a room what's happening, but in this case it was everywhere all of a sudden in terms of source material emerging very quickly. Absolutely,
yeah. And I think the scale of it was absolutely one of the big issues. And the other thing was the proximity to where the team was. So it took some negotiation, and the team ultimately, sort of 48 hours later, with some pretty heavy political, with a little p, political intervention by the UN and pressure to get the team across. Now, going across the confrontation line, of course, a challenge in itself. And when the team first went, they're in about 4 of these armored Land Cruisers. And when the team first crossed, they actually were shot at, and one of the vehicles was damaged. I suspect it wasn't a deliberate assassination attempt or killing attempt. I think it was probably more just reminding the team that where they were and who was in charge, and their life was in other people's hands if they so chose. But the team ultimately, they withdrew. They got another vehicle. I mean, massively brave. So impressive of my colleagues to then decide to return, cross the confrontation line, and away they go into the investigation. A quick touch on the investigation. Essentially, you're looking at 3 things. It's like a police investigation. You're looking for evidence. The 3 things you're after is you're looking at material samples, whether you're taking those from the ground, whether you're taking ammunition fragments, whether you're taking samples from victims. There are markers and indicators. Some are more challenging for some of the agents. For other agents, particularly nerve agents, it's a relative, I wouldn't say straightforward, but there are some clear markers that you can observe, produce as evidence. So that's the first thing, is getting material evidence. The second thing is interviews. And of course, if you can interview a survivor you're taking a sample from as well, there's some really good corroboration evidence that you can obviously produce there, but also witnesses, medical staff, that sort of thing. And then ultimately then is documentation evidence as well, if looking at hospital records and that sort of thing, and pulling that all together to produce some good science, some good evidence base. And the real challenge of international investigations, of course, is because there's that political dimension, because there are stakeholders, some of whom can be quite powerful, who want to influence how your findings might occur. It's not just like a national police investigation you would have in a country where basically the 2 stakeholders are society versus the criminal. You've got in an international organization, you may have other countries as well that have an interest and maybe not want the truth to come out. And so that thin line, that narrow line that has to be trod, I mean, of course, continuity of evidence is crucial in any legal setup, but particularly important because those are the things that will trump the political power that stakeholders don't want the truth to come out might choose to wield. And that really was then the trigger, because President Obama the year before had talked about red lines in 2012, and there was a drumbeat for punishing Syria. The mandate for the investigation didn't include attribution, and that again, that's one of the limitations in an international community and everyone having to agree stuff, is that there was no mandate for that team to identify who the perpetrator was, which I know can be quite challenging. And expectation wise, there's plenty of the public that said, well, it's clearly Syria, we need to attack them. Well, that's maybe, but the team didn't have that mandate, and therefore when producing evidence from the international context, that's not a course of action they can take. But it was clear the United States and France particularly were very bullish about attacking Syria. Of course, famously in the British Parliament, when David Cameron put it to the Parliament, actually Parliament said no. And I think that's probably reflected the kind of war weariness and the blood and treasure that had happened in the last 2 decades within Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're at this sort of stage where it was teetering on military action. And then supposedly there's this chance remark by John Kerry, who's the US, the Foreign Secretary equivalent, to Lavrov, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs head. You sort of said, well, if Syria comes to the table, joins the Chemical Weapons Convention, we won't bomb, we'll send inspectors in. And that was the trigger then for the deployment that ultimately we went into at the end of September in 2013. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of politics. And of course, we're being sort of swept up in that. By that stage, because Syria was going to become a member state, everything had to be accelerated. So the formal processes, usually a country that joins the Chemical Weapons Convention, it might take a year to sort of spin up this. And possessor state might take even longer with lots of liaison visits and all this. The mandate we were given, which essentially was driven by the United States, was you've got 30 days. You've got 30 days to give us a declaration, for us, the OPCW, to verify that declaration, disable the capability somehow. I mean, the conventions, there's some very key specific words that are used, and we couldn't use, destroy. It had to be disable at the first instance. And ultimately had to destroy certainly the agent and the precursors that was already existing, but also the capability to make any more. You're reliant on Syria's declaration, but this accelerated process was clearly going to pose a challenge for us. And one of the key things was, destruction of the agent. As it turned out, it's about 1,500 tons, a bit less than that, 1,300 tons of agent. Where was that destruction going to take place? And that was something that was not answered until way after we actually deployed into country.
So
if it hadn't have been for the existence of the OPCW, I guess another route would have been a more bilateral approach or a trilateral approach, but it wouldn't have been possible. I mean, the fact you had these standing capacities in the OPCW. So I guess the question is, how fundamental was the existence of the OPCW to that process of disarmament, A, being agreed, and B, happening?
I mean, we've got to look back. Don't forget, you sort of had the UNSCOM processes in Iraq a decade, actually 2 decades before that. So developing scratch teams and deploying to do an assessment and analysis and ultimately monitoring of the destruction of a chemical weapon capability is feasible. The difference is that this is a full-scale civil war that's going on. So Iraq was sort of pre-Gulf War One. Some of it was, and that is slightly different, where it's still a benign environment. I mean, it might be sort of slightly awkward and hostile for the inspectors, and certainly a number of my OPCW colleagues are former ONSCOM and then UNMOVIC inspectors. Yeah, sometimes it's pretty. The working in Iraq was pretty unpleasant, dealing with the Saddam regime and the security forces and police and that sort of thing. But doing it in a civil war is an entirely different matter. Now, all the declaration of the material Syria declared, again, we have to take it as read. We can have a separate discussion about whether it was accurate or not in a different thing. And by the way, spoiler alert, it isn't. It wasn't, I don't think. Evidence would suggest it isn't. At the time, we obviously not, and all very open. We had various national delegations would come and speak to us. When the declaration came out, the general consensus was from the sort of the Western powers, shall we say, was that we'll give this a B+ in terms of how good they think the declaration is. It's good enough, and we'll run with this. And I think this is part of the thing. So, if the OPCW hadn't existed, I'm sure some kind of workaround was. I remember hearing some planning figures about there was talk about a sort of a UN intervention, a peace-building intervention, but there had to have been a ceasefire, almost like Bosnia, really, a decade beforehand or 2 decades beforehand. But I think to have had that, the peace conditions simply weren't there. And I think the US also and the West also had a concern, frankly, that if the Syrian regime had fallen, then this significant quantity of agent had fallen into opposition hands. If some of those opposition forces had been essentially the Al-Qaeda and ultimately IS aligned, then you're into a whole new world of concern. And obviously subsequently IS was accused and actually found by the OPCW to have used agent in various attacks in the east of the country. So I think the 80% solution, the pragmatic approach, was very much there. But I think, deploying troops and having a UN or a peace building a la Bosnia or Rwanda, I think simply wouldn't have been viable given the fighting conditions that were there at the time.
And indeed, we don't need to go into the disinformation side around it. We've covered it quite nicely in another episode. But just to give a sense of the complexity of it, I mean, the threat of Syria collapsing was actually something that Vladimir Putin repeatedly focused on in his communications with the British public and British politicians. This idea of the collapse of that regime would be a much bigger threat to international security. So you can see how muddied the waters were around at this time, and it was a very divisive issue. The questions of intervention, no-fly zones, all sorts of things were being discussed.
Yeah, and I think that, to be honest, I think that's a fair one. To be honest, I really do. I mean, I remember one of the planning sessions, and we were told, and I think it was public actually, that US is sort of an estimate of what a peace building troop levels were, given that we had half an idea of how many facilities there were. It's 20 odd sites that were declared. Some of sites had multiple facilities on it, and the Americans were talking about 200,000 or 300,000 troops. So when, of course, we send our merry band of ultimately about 40 odd inspectors, I was sort of telling the guys, each inspector's worth 20,000 US troops. Just saying, guys, we're pretty good. All very tongue in cheek, of course. But I think that was the sort of the enormity that a more muscular intervention would have had to be.
So the initial thing wasn't a declaration, was it? There was I know legal aid stuff, but what was the term that was used?
Disclosure. So the term was disclosure. Again, because the convention's very clear, and some of the discussions we had, when the first mooted, we'll have to move the agent out of country because it's too dangerous. There were people saying, well, the convention says you can't move it across borders. Now, okay, that's fine, but this is now real. The convention was written for two large countries, United States and Russia and others, to in a peaceful environment go through a process of destruction and accountability for the weapons that you had made. Realpolitik now and reality now kicks in, and it simply wasn't possible. So things had to be altered. The acceleration of everything. This idea that essentially, ultimately, we came on with when we looked at the verification, which essentially was to go onto these sites with a list and tick off stuff, identify it and tick it off. But the second thing was disablement. So the teams on the ground became judge, jury, and executioner, walking around the site saying, okay, destroy that, and however that was, and the improvised destruction of it, which in other countries would have been, really quite comprehensive. This is why we ended up, trucks driving into vessels, smashing stuff up with gas axes and angle grinders and all that. So it was all had to be improvised.
And I guess in that respect, then the experiences from UNSCOM, this idea of in-field working out how to destroy and disable and what counts was in some respects also negotiated on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. And that's already interesting because, of course, being a relatively hierarchical system that the Syrian government was, and actually in some ways the UN system is as well. It's very hierarchical, empowering people to make decisions on the ground. But I felt that the Syrians felt that if they didn't comply to this deadline, then they were potentially going to be attacked. So there was, once the declaration happened, and for whatever that declaration was, I think they kind of wrote that off. So they weren't going to try and impede this. This wasn't a sort of a cat and mouse game that some of the UNSCOM stuff was.
Yeah.
I think this was very much, no, we are going to give this up and play with a straight bat on this, because otherwise the consequence is that we might get, a good tomahawking and the regime falls. So the cooperation was relatively good.
So just for the benefit of the listener, could you just give me a sense of what type of things were covered, and also how the Syrians went about knowing what they had and communicating that?
Yeah, so it was clear that we knew that the Syrian program, which essentially was developed to counter Israel's nuclear program, and bear in mind the Syrians also had a nuclear program as well, which the Israelis terminated somewhat with an attack on one of their reactors. But in terms of their program, they essentially declared an amount of unitary agent. They also then declared a much larger amount of precursors for nerve agents. So the unitary agent was a vesicant, and then we had both the precursors then, both for a vesicant and also nerve agents as well. And then they're declaring production and filling capability as well. Just to say that the convention, is quite clear that what constitutes a chemical weapon is either agent itself, precursors, specific manufacturing, filling, handling, storage, weapons, and then any other material that is designed specifically for the chemical program. So that's how it all kind of fits in there. Those are the definitions. So we had to work out, firstly, verify the quantities of agent and precursors, and destruction TBC. And then in terms of the production, the mixing, the filling, storage, we had to work out what was empty and clean and could be destroyed there on the spot. And then ultimately then the weapons as well, so unfilled munitions as well. So that's what we were kind of facing. The munitions ultimately were either aircraft bombs or warheads for rockets. Essentially, we had 3 teams set up, inspection teams that were set up, and again, it's very much the trust but verified. So this is not now an investigation. These are inspections. Sites were dotted all over the country, mainly in the western part, but some, quite a significant number of hours drive away.
And that distributed production is something, of course, historically has made a lot of sense. We saw the fate of the uranium enrichment work they were doing, which Israel put an end to. And of course, that goes all the way back. So even in the Second World War, when the UK had its program, distributed production and storage was something which was strategically a sensible thing to do. You then received some documents as an organisation, which listed what Syria admitted to in terms of the scale and scope of its programme, and in particular sites where there was relevant things happening. So what happens?
Because we had these 2 deadlines, one was to validate the declaration, and the second one then was to disable within 30 days. So the teams worked a really hard routine, which essentially was 1 day inspection, one day report writing and planning, and then one day moving to the next site. So really hard graft. And the teams were, as I said, moving up and down the country. And the challenge was a time and space one, but also then relatively quickly saying, okay, most of the sites required 2 visits because you were going there firstly to do your verification, and secondly to identify the items that needed to be destroyed. And then it was a sort of a return visit happening at some point where we went back and the items that were destroyed, and bear in mind, we used a lot of these sort of tamper-proof seals and that sort of thing to identify particular items, and saying, when we come back in 3 days' time, we expect these things to be destroyed. This is how we expect you to destroy them. Cut them up with a gas axe or a plasma cutter, or get them crushed, or whatever it was. There's the improvised method. So that was the sequence of events. 20 odd sites, sort of double the number of actual facilities. So sometimes there may be a production facility and a filling facility, or there may be a filling facility and a bunch of unfilled munitions. And so this whole process and cycle went on. And ultimately we visited most of the sites. There were a couple that we couldn't do. One of them was declared as empty and was in the opposition area. And ultimately we made the decision, to risk teams to go across the confrontation line to look at an empty hangar wasn't worth the risk. We'd also looked at remote viewing. We did some sort of fairly discreet viewing, i.e. we might not just go there in a big armoured convoy. But ultimately we were satisfied that declaration we were satisfied with the declaration. We were satisfied with the disablement, and then it was a question of how we're going to plan the destruction of the precursors and the unitary agent.
Fantastic. So I guess I have 2 questions. The first one relates to the destruction was done by the Syrians, and this is also, I think, reflected in standard procedure, which was inherited from the OPCW regime, right? So this idea that it's the host state.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the responsibility of the state party to do the destruction. Yeah.
That on their side, we will probably never hear about. But this primarily was unfilled munitions and production sites they were destroying at this point. We'll get back to the agent in a few seconds.
Yeah, it was. Frankly, it was pretty crude. It was, we had this one, the first one actually from a takeover of Unscom, is that I had the first site we did, which you can imagine was very high profile. It was in the first week of October. We had a whole bunch of unfilled munitions there, aircraft bombs and some missile warheads as well. And I sort of said, why don't you drive a tank over these? We'll just crush them. And this tank just sort of went over these, drove up these bombs. All the bombs were laid out, drove along them, drove down the other side. No damage whatsoever. It's like, oh God, I was hoping the visual effect and a bit of confidence building, and off away we go. And one of the Syrian guys there was very proud to say, he sort of thumped his chest and said, "We're made in Syria. This is really good quality." So we ended up with particularly angle grinders, gas axes, plasma torches, all those sort of cutting type stuff. And you don't need to do too much damage. These are relatively precision items, right? So you only need, you need to put some strategically placed cuts or holes in these things, and they essentially become unusable. So the challenges for them actually were more about getting hold of plasma torches and cutters and people that could do it, and moving around the country to be able to do this, quite heavy manual work. We used the bulldozers to crush big, 5,000 litre storage tanks. They could be crushed. So there was all that kind of improvised stuff. But that, of course, left us still with the agent and the precursors, and it was clear that very early on that this wasn't going to happen in Syria itself. So whilst it was their responsibility, then the partner nations, particularly the United States, sort of led by the United States, was that we were going to have to look at an offshore destruction solution.
It's funny, actually. It reminds me of years and years ago, but one of the individuals had managed to disable one of the centrifuges purely by holding with his fingers one part of it, which was very sensitive and very calibrated. So the second, I guess, question I have in relation to these teams you deployed is, obviously it's clear that their job was to oversee and verify destruction. What was the kind of biographical character of these individuals who went out there? Was it quite varied? Were these ex-military? And obviously they would have had the security detail with them, but had many of these people had similar types of field experience before?
That's a great question. It's actually, rather self-indulgently, is probably the bit I'm most proud of. Is so in the teams now. Coming from my sort of background as it is, I'd been in conflicts before and was sort of fairly familiar with it. But actually, the number of people on the team, the OPCW team, that had been in conflict environments was very few. And bear in mind that the selection process for the OPCW, there was no discussion at all of going into a conflict-affected area. For the chemical weapon munition specialists, it was generally about going to destruction facilities and monitoring it in these giant sort of plants. It was plant rooms you were really watching. There was some old chemical weapons that we would visit in various parts of Europe, legacy munitions from the First World War, or actually in the case of China in the Second World War as well, that Japanese munitions from then. The chemists, and particularly the chemical engineers, their job was to visit facilities around the globe that had a conceivable capability to be a dual use. So they might be producing all sorts of industrial chemicals, but had potentially had the setup to be dual use. And so these guys and girls were hired to go and do this. It was not about war. So it is, and I suppose the other thing I'm proud of is that in 2012, building up that capability was something that I sort of led on within the organization to build this sort of what we ended up calling the contingency operations, and training in hostile environment and moving in armored vehicles, first aid, all those the skills that you need to work in these environments. I'm not talking about war, it's not about carrying guns or anything like that, but still, you've seen the photographs of the guys and girls in armored vests, or in protective vests and helmets and all that sort of thing. So that was a step change, and the demographic was from all over, males and females, scientists. There were some former soldiers there. Not all the former soldiers had been in a conflict environment themselves, and I think I'm really proud the fact that those people agreed to do it, and all my team came home, which I'm really chuffed with.
Because I guess, it's a different gig to being sent to Stuttgart or Heidelberg and staying at a Marriott hotel, and then visiting an industrial estate.
Absolutely.
To this.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I said, none of these people were untrained. We had a training program. They were all volunteers. With the UN supported us, particularly the UN Department of Safety and Security, the DSS, that were absolutely superb. It was led by another now dear friend as well, another Canadian, in fact, who probably got it. And the UN have a pretty good system of training their people before deploying into hostile environments. So, yeah, that was the challenge. And the next sort of step was how we were going to look at destroying this agent.
So let's move on to destruction then. I guess a thing to start with for the uninitiated is, could you give a sense of what the agents of interest here were in terms of both, as you call them, live agents, but also precursors? What types of volumes we were dealing with?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of bound by some confidentiality. There is open source out there. I'm neither going to confirm or deny that what was out there. But essentially, there was vesicant and there was nerve agents,
and also I guess it's also precursors to those as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So there was no unitary nerve agent. The unitary agent, ready to go agent, was the mustard, and then there were precursors for mustard and then the nerve agents. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of the precursors, but essentially, the precursors generally it was the final two chemicals that you would mix to produce your agent. Some of these agents can be quite corrosive. They're quite corrosive or quite quite volatile once they're manufactured. So, because of the nature of their capability, actually the setup was that the last two precursors were mixed prior to use. So mixing, filling and deployment in hours, they weren't at the level of technology, like, for example, like the Russians or the Americans were, where you could have munitions filled with a nerve agent and then they might sit in a store for a decade or 2 decades. That was beyond the capability that the Syrians had at that time.
And of course, we can infer some things from the history. Unfortunately, if you live in Belgium or France, filled mustard munitions, are something which regularly turn up and are destroyed. I visited one of the sites just outside Ypres, and met some individuals there. Some of those individuals actually ended up working at the OPCW.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And in that case, of course, you're dealing with filled munitions, but you're often dealing with one or two that come in at a time. You assess them and destroy them. Historically, there's also been a need to occasionally destroy some of the larger pots of mustard or larger volumes of mustard. So the destruction of mustard, and of course, under OPCW membership, many states, I guess, had some experience in destroying either munitions or storage pots of the agent, as it were. And I guess as well, historically looking at programs, in terms of volume, you would expect mustard to be a sizable volume of that stockpile.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're talking of, essentially, again, I don't want to go for broadly, but it was sort of hundreds of tons of unitary agent, and the total declaration, including precursors, was sort of around 1,500 tons, actually slightly less than that. That was broadly it. And options-wise, destruction in Syria is off the table. Then what are the options? Firstly, it's going to have to be transported, which is an issue in itself. It has to be transported safely. How's that going to happen? Who's going to do it? And then ultimately, what is the destination it's going to go to? Now, some initial planning that took place was, can we get a country as close as we can to Syria that's willing to accept this? Now, that's not an insignificant undertaking. That sort of quantity of agent, that country, essentially by default of it being the territory that the destruction takes place, would have instantly become the world's third largest possessor of chemical weapons. So you can imagine the infrastructure that might have been required for that.
For a layman's perspective, explain to me why destruction in Syria wasn't an option, if that's possible.
Yeah, yes, it's very straightforward. It was that the fact is that the country was ravaged by war. The front lines themselves were relatively porous, and to go and get a location, an industrial location of the scale to be, and bear in mind the technology and everything else, was just not viable. The second thing was the Syrians put their hands up and said, look, we're fighting a civil war. We simply don't have the capability to do this.
And logistically, in terms of in-country destruction, you would have had a logistical train of moving equipment and sourcing that equipment externally for destruction at scale. You also logistically would have required to be moving materials around within country to at least one destruction site. And so very quickly it becomes a task which is much neater to do outside. You're moving less stuff around, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, the technology that Syria possessed was pretty good, but ultimately, after 2 or 3 years of civil war, prioritization, the fact is at the time you're only controlling a third for the Syrian government, you're controlling a third of your own territory, albeit that tended to be the major conurbations, a lot of the industrial area, but even so the threat of attack was a concern. And frankly, they just said, look, okay, we'll put our hands up to it and we'll let you come and inspect us. But ultimately, we do not have the capability to destroy it. And even down to the fact that, we're dealing with the effluent afterwards, all that sort of thing. This is a wartime economy that frankly was ravaged, and B, had a prioritization, which was, I'm not showing sympathy for them. All I'm saying is that the material facts on the ground were that I think destruction in country for that quantity of agent, okay, it's dwarfed by the size of the Russian or the US capability, but as I said, India's capability, and India had a single location that was based on a training area that was huge and was absolutely remote, and they did that destruction over a period of a couple of years. They were expecting Syria to do this in a much accelerated, because obviously the longer the destruction took place, the greater the exposure to a risk. So off-country was really only the viable solution, and the challenge was ultimately that no country put their hand up to agree to that, and therefore the next hybrid solution was folks centered around the United States.
Now we move then, I guess, to the plan and execution of the feat, which I think we could probably safely say was the main reason that the OPCW won the Nobel Peace Prize a year or so later.
No, it was that year, in fact, actually 2013. So it wasn't just, I suspect it triggered it, but I mean, the OPCW had been doing some good stuff for years before that. So I'd love to claim the credit, but I think it's a bit more than us in Syria at the time. We were probably the catalyst that took it over the edge. So in the absence then of this option of going to a country, I should explain then that this, again, the OPCW in terms of agent, it has a list of agents. So the convention talks about chemical weapons. It specifies some particular agents and uses their chemical formula. It also but you also rank them. So it was schedules 1, 2, and 3. So schedule 1 agents are things like mustard, chemical name, chemical formula, chemical setup. And bear in mind, there are some variations to that, but that was clear. Schedule 2 agents may well be precursors, and some of those also then may have dual use. So you have to range them. So something like nerve agent doesn't have a doesn't have a civilian application whatsoever. Something like mustard doesn't have a civilian application, but some of the mustard precursors do have a civilian application. So what the convention was set up to do was to allow the civilian applications to sort of be used and exploited and whatever, but also at the same time make sure that actual chemical agent wasn't being produced. So there is a kind of a hierarchy of hazardous materials. And then, I mean, the other scheduled sort of chemicals then is things like chlorine, which of course was used as one of the first chemical weapons, but is heavily used in industry and certainly in the Middle East for things like water purification and sanitation. Most of your bathroom cleaning products will have chlorine in. So differentiating between peaceful use and military use, that's the sort of approach you take. So you have this sort of hierarchy of shall we say, hazard. So essentially, the intention was that for the unitary agent and for a particular precursors, they would have to be destroyed by a government. And it's, of course, clearly not like it's foresight, but the US. The US have some amazing destruction capabilities, chemical and otherwise, and some of those are mobile and deployable. And one of those capabilities then is these deployable field hydrolysis systems. When I say portable, I mean they come on the back of several big trucks, but they can be moved and flown. And ultimately, what the US did was a couple of these systems were deployed and put on board one of their large military naval vessels. I say military naval vessels, or actually the equivalent of the fleet or auxiliary. So sort of supply or transport ships. I mean, it's just superb engineering of putting these capabilities on board a giant transport vessel. This was the Cape Ray.
For a non-scientist, speaking to an engineer, hydrolysis, that's not just watering it down, is it?
No, it's not. No, there's actually a chemical reaction that's going on within the mixture of the material and the water. So yeah, you're right. It's not just dilution. What you're doing is that a chemical reaction is going in. Now, it depends on the nature of the agent that you're trying to destroy, of what ratio water might be to it. Obviously, when the water goes in with the agent, that produces effluent in itself. The output of that is effluent, which needs to be stored. One of the things I got involved with was sort of calls with various environmental groups that were concerned when the news broke that the US were planning, were offering up this destruction facility on the high seas. Doing it on the high seas was sort of, because it wasn't going to be on a territory, it demonstrated that sort of international involvement. But various environmental groups were concerned the US was going to just dump the agent over the side.
Which historically, dumping it over the side or cutting holes in the boat had certainly been a practice that had been employed for several decades immediately after the Second World War.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the various British and US operations, sea dumping after the war, and indeed to this day, off various places of the UK, certainly in the Baltic, and actually even as far as the Far East, there is mapped dumping grounds of hundreds of tons of agent that weaponized agent that went over the side. So, and in the Baltic today, fishermen still occasionally pick up balls of mustard, for example, that's leaked out of containers, and they produce these kind of, the best way of describing it is kind of football-sized puddings of mustard, where the skin of the ball actually has hydrolyzed, as through hydrolysis with the seawater. So you get this sort of hydrolyzed mustard, but inside that, if the ball breaks, the inside that is still potentially viable liquid mustard agent. So that was, so the sort of environmental groups, I think quite reasonably were concerned about that. So the US offered up this mobile destruction hydrolysis system for the unitary agent, and then one of the major precursors for the nerve agent.
And this is where the Cape Ray enters the story, which I imagine will be the cover image for this episode. So talk to me a bit about the ships involved, and didn't we also have some Scandinavian involvement in the process as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So this then came to the planning. I actually flew to Stuttgart and was involved in dealing with NATO, who sort of were taking over the ownership of this logistics problem. The Russians and the Chinese got involved. They didn't want to be part of the actual logistics piece. They ended up sending escort ships. But in terms of movement of the material, so essentially, the Denmark and Norway offered up commercial transport vessels, and think kind of sort of slightly more commercialized versions of cross-channel ferries. So big open deck ships that can have trucks driving off and on them. So the Danes produced one, again in the pictures, the blue one, the Ark Ventura, and then the Norwegians produced the big orange one, Tycho. A massive ship, much bigger than was needed. Certainly the Tycho was due for scrapping, and so the Norwegians offered this up and said, this will be its last sort of hurrah. Now, one of the key challenges is that with this material is coming in there, we don't necessarily know the quality of the containers. And so we needed to make sure, and once this stuff goes on the vessel, it's not going off until it leaves, it moves to its destination. So the two vessels, the Ark Ventura, the blue one, essentially was going to take on the mustard and the precursor for the nerve agents, the one that was going to be destroyed in the Cape Ray, and we'll come on to how that process took place. And then the Tycho the orange one, was going to take on the rest of the material. So one of the big jobs that we had to do was make sure that the containers that were being delivered to the port and ultimately being put onto this vessel, I mean, things like had to make sure it met all the hazardous goods transport regulations, both for that country, international, all that sort of thing. I mean, we put Syrians on courses on UN to make sure that the material was in the correct containers and was stacked and stored appropriately. Very important, because that safety, whilst the Syrians would not be in control of it once the vessels were at sea, those vessels still were exposed to the wind and the rain and storms and whatever. And the expectation initially was that the material would be on and gone from the vessels relatively quickly. As it turned out, it was a much longer process, and those vessels were at sea for months and holding some hazardous, quite hazardous material. So it was not an insignificant undertaking that the Danes and the Norwegians, and absolutely fair play to them. And they added their own naval vessels. They wanted a frigate each to escort those vessels. Other countries, the Brits included, we ended up supplying an escort ship as well. The Russians and the Chinese as well. And that's what this flotilla would go in. What we didn't want to do is end up storing lots of agent and precursor at the port in Latakia, because Latakia was still conceivably within rocket range from some of the opposition groups. So we had a reception area in the port. We bounded it by a whole bunch of the ISO containers, the big Connex containers you see on transport ships. Corralled that in there. That was guarded. We had all sorts of troops supporting us. And then as these convoys came in, we would open up them, check that they were configured appropriately to be put on board a vessel. We'd do random sampling to make sure that the material that we'd seen off. We had inspectors on site making sure that this material was going in to the containers. We actually had a GPS monitoring system, so we could monitor the movement of these containers as they drove through Syria. And some of these movements would take over a day, long travel times. Ultimately arriving at the port, that was coordinated then, that once they arrived at the port, we could do the administrative and making sure that we got what we said was on the list. That would then involve the vessels then who were offshore, calling them in, them arriving, going alongside, ramps coming down, and then the material being checked by them. The Danes had a portable X-ray machine, big enough to X-ray a truck, which was amazing, to make sure that they, that it was only the agent that was coming on board. The Norwegians, actually used the Danish X-ray machine. So these vessels were coming alongside, and then the material being transported onto the vessels, depending on what the nature of the agent or the nature of the material was.
And I remember, I think I've saw in one of your previous talks, the X-ray machine was very, very effective.
Yes, absolutely. So the first move was pretty tense, right? I mean, we had a sequence of calls. We had to call the Russian Navy and the Chinese, and the Syrians were very concerned because there were two NATO warships that were about to enter their water. The two warships didn't come into the port. It was only the two transport ships did. But the first day was the Danish vessel, the Ark Ventura, this blue vessel coming in there. And the first time the ramp came down, there was this single Danish Marine stood on the deck there, and I went over and greeted them. And opposite him then was the Syrian delegation, and I was sort of stood in the middle. I went in and said hello to him. I'm actually married to a Dane, or half a Dane, so we had a little bit of a connection, and my very lousy Danish just saying hello and welcome to Syria. And then the trucks come in, and the Danes actually were happy for the Syrians to drive these trucks on. which surprised me because I thought this, in theory it could be Danish territory and you might get people that wanted to, to claim asylum or anything. So, but prior to them going on, Danish customs, and I kid you not, we had, Danish Marines, special forces sort of rocking around in sort of wraparound shades and sort of low slung pistols. And then you had a Danish custom guy rock up and cool as anything. And they bring this giant X-ray machine out and you park the truck, get out of the truck. And then this X-ray machine X-rays the truck and the ISO container that's on the back of this flatbed truck. And yeah, the first time this happened and the Danish customs guy who'd been introduced to me and he came over to me and he sort of said, yeah, I think there's a weapon on one of these trucks. We don't want that to come on board the vessel. And I sort of turned to the Syrian general, my interlocutor, and said, I think there's a weapon on the truck. Can you, get the driver to take it off? So he sort of came over, got the driver, obviously told his minions to do it. He wasn't doing it himself, but and the driver came over and took his AK assault rifle out, out of this truck. And then he sort of turned to them guys and anyone else got weapons in the trucks? And all the drivers, there were 9 trucks. I absolutely remember this. And they all sort of sheepishly put their hands up and all sort of went over to their trucks and pulled out not only assault rifles, but also an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. These guys had these things because, again, they were concerned that they could be attacked when they're transported. So, yeah, that was that little vignette, which was quite amusing. And, yeah, the trucks came on. Once the trucks were loaded and the containers were secured on the vessel, then the vessel went out to sea again and back off to the offshore, outside Syrian waters to wait for the next transportation. We expected that process to take, several weeks. Ultimately, it took 6 months. And I think this is where we felt that the Syrians perhaps they felt the threat of an attack was now diminishing and they wanted to do it in their own time. And that, whether that was because they wanted to demonstrate that, they were all over it or demonstrate that they still had some control over this whole process, which, in the best will in the world, will have some degree of humiliation about it because they're essentially holding their hands up to the international community and doing what they're told. The speed of deliveries very much slowed down, and the material consequence of that was that these 2 Danish transport vessels spent 6 months at sea. And I'm pretty sure that the Tycho, the big orange one, as soon as it finished its job, it went for scrap. And I also think that actually its insurance ran out, its maritime insurance ran out because it was due for scrap. I mean, that's another story, which frankly I'm not cited on, of actually being at sea for 6 months with this agent on there.
So what's quite humorous there as well is that has resonances with the use of Liberty ships post-Second World War, which were mass-produced. They were cheap. That's why they were reduced to scale. And a large proportion of those ended up taking on one big final mission, though they ended up at the bottom of the sea very often.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's actually for that destruction or the disposal of chemical agent after that's the very thing that they did around, again, in the Baltic and certainly in the North Atlantic as well, where they would fill the ships with chemical agent and then pilot them out to perhaps not as far offshore as they should have done, but and then sink them. Yeah, that was certainly one of the processes.
I think the acronym is CHASE, isn't it? Cut holes and sink them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Op Chase was the American. I can't remember there was a British op name as well. So these 2 vessels, then we've talked about the sort of the unitary agent and one of the nerve agent precursors. The plan for that then on that blue ship was that we eventually negotiated then a port in Italy where the transloading was going to take place. But that in itself meant that conceivably Italy, for a period of X number of hours, was going to be the world's 3rd largest possessor of chemical weapons. It was translated so that the Cape Ray, the US vessel, was moored next to or alongside or opposite on a pier with the Ark Ventura, and essentially these containers were driven off one vessel across the pier or along the pier and then straight up onto the Cape Ray, which is another roll-on, roll-off vessel, which had on one of its decks then these 2 hydrolysis systems. So that was the fate of the unitary agent and the key precursor of concern. And then the rest of the precursors could actually be destroyed in regular civilian chemical destruction facilities, industrial facilities. The OPCW put out tenders. Of course, that sort of slightly blows a hole in the confidentiality clause within the organisation which talks about that a country's declaration is secret, or is secret as the country wants it to be. But of course, if you're putting commercial tenders out, you've got to define what the agent or what the chemical compounds are and what the quantities are.
Yeah, you can't wait to say it's at least a ton.
Yeah. So again, dear listener, you can go out there and find out the chemicals. But essentially, that was the bulk of the chemical material that was out there. And essentially, various industrial chemical companies put bids in for the destruction. I think ultimately some of the material went to Finland, to Germany, to the UK, and to the United States. The Tycho, the big orange vessel, essentially just did a milk round, went to the various ports, offloaded the material, and that was transported as any other hazardous material would be transported, with all the safety regimes that might be in place. And they went ultimately for chemical destruction in commercial plants.
Well, thank you for that. I think what's fascinating for me is this was a very impressive technical feat. But of course, as with most aspects of the technical, it's very difficult to distinguish from the political. And of course, many commentators on this have incredibly ambiguous feelings, or even very heated feelings, towards the context of the Syrian program and Syrians' use of chemical weapons and other allegations, and ISIS and other organizations that may have used them. And so it's very easy to kind of brush over that as a detail, with actually, from a historical perspective, that process that was underwent in both political and technical terms and operational terms remains very significant, and I think will remain very significant for a long time. I mean, let's hope there is not another situation where we do have to remove large chemical stocks from a state in conflict, but certainly in terms of a class of technical and political and operational challenge that might face an organisation such as the OPCW, it certainly seems to be very important.
Speaking with UN colleagues, of course, who were vastly more experienced in peace or operations, should we say UN operations in conflict affected areas, I think to a person they sort of said that this was a successful mission. There were plenty of commentators saying it couldn't be done. Now clearly an awful lot of it was improvised, but we pulled through, and ultimately I'd call it the 80% solution. I'm mindful of a comment around, there's been plenty of criticism that we didn't get it all out. That's undoubtedly true. Syria retains a capability. I don't know how large. I'm sure the Western intelligence agencies have got an idea. But like I said at the sort of earlier on, it was the 80% solution, which was good enough. And as a guy called Jake Sullivan, who was a national security advisor for Vice President Biden at the time, he sort of said, well, what's the alternative? We bomb them, the Syrian regime falls apart, and we're let loose with what would have been at least 1,500 tons of chemical agent and precursors kicking around in a country that was in anarchy, and of some of which of the territory was controlled by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, okay, was it all of it? Probably not, almost certainly not. Did the Syrian regime fall? No, it didn't. Everyone expects kind of clean endings to this, and unfortunately realpolitik is the absolute opposite. It's a compromise. There's lots of compromises that go on, but I think ultimately, perhaps I would say that because I was employed by the UN and the UN system for 7 years, and they paid my wages, but it was the least worst outcome. It could have been a lot worse, and for that, I think that's why I would still consider it to be a successful, if not imperfect, but successful task.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jerry, for speaking to me today. That talk was absolutely fascinating, and I got a lot out of our discussion. I guess there's a couple of things to end with. First of all, if individuals listen to the show, I know we have a broad range of technical experts, but also people of general interest in this area. If people want to find your work or what you're up to at the moment, you're on LinkedIn or anything like that?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jerry Smith on LinkedIn. I actually work in the insurance sector now. The insurance sector has can insure against around terrorist CBRN effects, and I advise on that, but also on wider sort of crisis management issues as well. So that's where I work to this day.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for making the time to speak to me.
No problem at all. It's been an absolute pleasure.